Hey guys, Nikki here. I'm here today to do a movie review to go with The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and Wicked. I would have reviewed Wicked the musical, except... So, the original Wizard of Oz that was produced in 1939 with Judy Garland and other cast is the one that I was viewing since it was available on Netflix. It was not one of the first movies to use color, but it was one of the first movies to use color to emphasize fantasy, the fantasy aspect of the movie, which I found to be very unique and very effective. Additionally, watching this movie as an adult was definitely a different experience. I remember watching this when I was growing up, and there were parts that were very alarming for me, being a sweet 7-year-old, that weren't as terrifying as an adult. That being said, it follows the same plot as the book, so you follow Dorothy coming from Kansas, getting dropped into Oz, killing a witch, and then her adventure and the acquisition of her crew kind of as a natural part of her journey to see the wizard. I think that the movie overall was interesting, I guess. So with that, I'll jump into the likes here. As I mentioned, it used color to emphasize the fantasy element of Oz, and I personally loved that, especially when you take into consideration how Kansas was described when the book was written, that it was like a harsh farm life, and everything was bleached and barren, and this, that, and the other thing, that really gave you kind of a more bleak outlook. So I think that using the sepia or black and white film really emphasized how worn down Kansas felt to Dorothy at the time, versus Oz was just this new and unique place, and I think the color really emphasized how different and fresh it was from where she came from. Another plus with me was the continuity of character. I really appreciated that some of the characters from the farm kind of crossed boundaries into Oz, and I think it made the characters a little bit more relatable, having them rooted so firmly from the beginning, but it also made them less creepy for joining a child on her journey, and it really allowed the story to progress, I find, a lot more naturally, because being characters that were so familiar to her, I feel like Dorothy was able to more naturally talk to them. And then my third positive is that the characters just in general had more depth. One of my big things with The Wizard of Oz is that I wasn't particularly keen on the characters. And they're still not my favorite in the movie, but they definitely were just very well represented by the actors. They really brought the characters to life for me, and just with how the story was set up in the movie, that like with the changes that were made, it just allowed the characters to have a more natural personality. They didn't feel as boxed into their stereotype. They still had a stereotype, but there was just more dimension to the emotion shown. And now I'll move on to my negatives. And for the most part, they're pretty minor, but they largely involve changes made to the movie that I think streamlined the experience, but just ended up leaving out a lot of character. The first one is Glinda. In the book, she kisses Dorothy on the head, and this gives Dorothy a kind of protection. People are afraid to touch her because Glinda is such a powerful witch. And this is ignored entirely in the movie, and I think it had added a very interesting dynamic to why Dorothy was so successful with her journey, whereas here it felt more like, oh, dumb luck. My second negative was that the traveling feel didn't translate well to the silver screen. I think that had to do with how much of their traveling was cut. So instead of being a journey with a very adventurous feel by getting to see all these different parts of the world, it was just a very straightforward journey with not a lot of flavor. just with how it was done in the movie, because they left out a whole region of Oz. There were some really interesting side characters who helped them out in their time of need that they didn't end up interacting with at all. And then that leads me to my final negative, which is they got rid of overall just a lot of the interesting lore that was mentioned in the book, and there wasn't a ton of it. So I was very sad to see that so much of it was neglected in favor of a more streamlined story. I guess it has to do with probably more the time it was produced than anything else, but it's still just, it made the plot less flavorful and just a lot less enjoyable for me. Now, I'm going to move to the characters. So, as I kind of mentioned with my likes and dislikes, they did do a lot of character work here in terms of changes. There was the continuity of characters from reality to Oz. There was the way that, and with that continuity and the way the story was aimed, which was slightly different than the book, it allowed for the characters to be a little bit more dynamic. Not so much that they grew, but they felt less like a cardboard cutout of the character they're representing. And I really just think that the actors did a phenomenal job bringing them to life. And I really do think that the casting largely was pretty spot on. I mean, especially with like the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion, they are all in costume. And while Dorothy is a little bit older, or Judy Garland is a little bit older than I think Dorothy was supposed to be, I think it was like the appropriate age, and she just brought a really nice sense of innocence to Dorothy's character that really stayed true to the book, even if she was older than anticipated. And, like, overall, I mean, I'm still not crazy about the characters. That's because I wasn't crazy about them in the book. They're a lot less violent here, which is, like... but it's still not great. And that's all I really have to say about the characters. I'll just jump right into my wrap-up here for you. So, as usual with my movies, I'm going to do the book-to-movie adaptation score and then the movie unto itself. In terms of the adaptation, I feel like this book is more like a 3.5 out of 5 in terms of accuracy, because while they stayed pretty close to like the bare bones of the story, there were so many changes they made that streamlined the story and just cut out a lot of the flavor and adventure that I really missed seeing. Because in the book, it added such vibrancy to Oz, and just like in my honest opinion, I really feel like streamlining it the way they did just took away some of the whimsy associated with Oz. And one big thing was within that is the changes they made to the witches, like Glinda's role, and in the book, how they kind of talk about the Wicked Witch of the West. It doesn't really get touched on, and she is just left as just this evil figurehead she was left super flat in the movie. And she did have a bit more character in the book, and I wish that had been able to have been explored a little bit more in terms of like the magical artifacts she had and what exactly she had done. One thing they didn't change, but I was very surprised, is that they didn't make the Wizard of Oz a more empathetic character. He was still an asshat. I'm sorry, that line of, "I'm not a bad man, I'm just a bad wizard," is complete bull. Like, and of all the changes they could have made, I definitely thought they would have made the Wizard of Oz a little bit more of a sympathetic or relatable character. And that's all I really have to say about the adaptation. Definitely not the worst, but neither was it particularly accurate in the grand scheme of things. And then I'll move to the movie score. This one was a little bit harder for me because I know some of the things I didn't enjoy had to do with the time that the movie was produced. So I was really trying to keep that in perspective. So really, I end up doing, the movie is really more of a 4 out of 5 for me. Like, there's so many things I enjoyed, and I think that the practical effects they used were really, really good for the time. Like, it really added a sense of mystery. And although with my more critical eye of special effects, because of how much farther it's come in the last 80 years, I'm really trying to give them points because I think it would have been very, very realistic at the time, even though I find them a lot less realistic now. I did appreciate like the use of the black and white to color just to give Oz that bigger, more sense of whimsy and fantasy. by having it be so much more vibrant than the real world. That was really good. The actors presented the characters really well. They had, like, the acting's a little bit over the top, but I think it really matched a lot of the characters, so that fit really well for me. There was a lot more singing than I remembered. I'm not someone who particularly enjoys musicals. So I mean, like, the songs felt so unnecessary to me, and they could have taken those out and just, like, I don't know, put some of that lore in that I really wanted. And, like, overall, the story was very straightforward with minimal twists. I think to a young audience, or even an audience just looking for a simple journey with a little bit of an adventure feel, would probably get a lot of enjoyment out of it, and I can definitely see why it was so popular when it came out and how it's kind of stuck with the masses moving forward. There's enough action to keep you engaged. There's enough singing to kind of summarize and be, like, fun and bubbly to keep, like, different members of the audience engaged. And overall, it was just, I think, especially for the time, it was pretty dang interesting. It's not my favorite movie, and I probably will never watch it again, and that kind of explains the 4 out of 5 for me. That's all I really have, so I will see you guys in the next video.